Today we have another From Software type of ranking video going over the best weapon class or weapon category in every single one of the Souls games. Now the weapon classes include things like straight swords, daggers, hammers, spears, greatswords, stuff like that. Now yes, Bloodborne and Sekiro do not actually have any weapon classes, so those are not going to be on the list. And in terms of the criteria, once again, it is just going to be for PvE, and it is going to take into account how good the options actually are inside of the class. So the weapon class might actually have some really good movesets, but if their options aren't really that game breaking, then I'm probably not going to value them as much. I just thought it'd be much easier that way to try and determine which one is actually the best. So the best way to actually interpret this video will be which weapon class actually houses the best weapons. But anyway, let's just get into it. Starting off with Demon Souls. Now this game actually has the most balance between all of the weapon classes. Every single one of these is just perfectly viable, except for the fist weapons. These things suck, they're terrible, never use them. Honestly, even the bows are good. But with that being said, I'm gonna still pick the straight swords. They're very easy to use, they have amazing movesets, and they also house very good options as well. In Demon Souls, every single weapon inside of its own class does actually share the exact same moveset, so there actually are no unique movesets at all in this game, which is unfortunate, but it does make it easy to talk about. And for the straight swords, they're nice and quick. One-handed and two-handed is very solid. I think the curved swords get the better light attack combo, but straight swords always just do get more variety. The running attacks are extremely quick and cover very nice distance. The heavy attack is a very solid poke, and whether or not you actually want the weapon one-handed or two-handed will be dependent on whether you actually do horizontal or vertical swipes. But the main reason as to why they're actually going to get this high into the list is because all of their options are just really good. The blue blood sword being the best one. This weapon is unique in the fact that it actually does scale off the luck stat, and it scales extremely well off the luck stat. And the good thing about the luck stat in this game is that it doesn't really have a soft cap like all of the other damaging stats. You can just go into like very high levels and benefit just as much as if it was earlier in the game. And it still actually does retain scalings in strength, faith, and magic as well. Doesn't really scale as well on those, but the fact that you're still going to get a bit more damage out of it. And it also can be buffed, which this thing can just probably result in the highest DPS in the entire game. Another good straight sword is going to be the Knight Sword. Does get some of the highest base damage, gets very good scalings in all different types of infusions, also can be buffed. And also you get another weapon like the Crisp Blade, which is not going to be that good of a primary based option. The damage isn't really that crazy, but this is going to be the best option if you're going to go with magic types of builds because it does boost the damage of your magic spells, which magic in this game is just broken and honestly better than using almost any weapon in this game. And the fact that this is a straight sword is just going to help propel this one to be the best class in Demon Souls. As for the best weapon class in Dark Souls 1, I don't think it's going to be as balanced as it is in Demon Souls. I definitely believe there are just some classes that are a lot better than others. And for me, I think the halberds are just going to be the best one. And honestly, it's probably not even that close. Maybe like the Ultra Greatswords could be a close second. But for me, definitively, the halberds are the best. These things have amazing stagger potential, which in this game is incredibly underrated. And the fact that you can actually stagger pretty well while doing it at a really nice distance and still do this much damage, while actually having some really good movesets as well, it's kind of just broken. You get good variation in horizontal, vertical swipes, and almost all of these actually do have some unique type of heavy attack. Things like the Gargoyle's Halberd or the regular Halberd do get a spin to win with its heavy, which is obviously really good for crowd control. Something like the Black Knight Halberd gets a really nice jumping lunging attack, and the Great Scythe and Life Hunt Scythe get a really cool quick lunge sideward swipe. All of these are really good and have their own specific types of uses. And honestly, you can go with any single one of these halberds on this list and you'll find plenty of success. They're just all that good. Now for me, I think the Great Scythe is going to be the best one on here. I think it's the best weapon in the entire game. I think it gets the best moveset with its really quick downward chops and the really fast sideward swipe heavy attack and running attack. It gets some of the most range in class, also weighs the lightest, low requirements, and it does get some of the highest damage, if not the highest damage. It might be just behind the Gargoyle's Halberd in terms of damage, but it does get slashing damage and it does get bleed, which is just better to have. Now the Life Hunt Scythe can be just as good. It is the exact same moveset, actually can do more bleed, but it doesn't really do as much damage because it can't be buffed and it does get a lot less range. The Black Knight Halberd is obviously incredible to have, does get some of the highest base damage, although a lot of the other halberds can out damage it at later levels. And it is really heavy, but it does get the trade-off of having the highest stagger damage out of all of the other halberds. Like this thing can stagger just as well as some ultra great swords. And then you even have a weapon like the Lucerne, which is basically just as good as all the other halberds, but it just gets piercing damage, which piercing damage is just amazing in every single game because counter-attack damage exists and you can pair it alongside the Leer Ring and it could probably make for some of the highest damage output in the entire game. So I do believe there are plenty of good weapon classes in Dark Souls 1, but none are as consistently good as the halberds. The best weapon class in Dark Souls 2, it did come down to two different ones, the hammers and the piercing swords, of which I'm gonna go with the piercing swords. As much as I love hammers, it's just undeniable how easy these things are to use and how many positives they actually have going for it. Like, these are some of the lightest weapons in the entire game, but they also have really quick attacks, don't consume much stamina, low requirements, and they also just get like the highest damage per second in the entire game as well. Which obviously that is the recipe for success in this game, just having lighter weapons in general are just always going to be better in my opinion. Yes, large weapons can be viable, but in a game where stamina cost is so high, it means you're gonna have to spec into a lot of endurance when you're using these larger types of weapons. And leveling up the endurance stat doesn't even boost your stamina that much. And also when using larger weapons, you're gonna have to spec into vitality because that's a stat that exists, which arguably is worse than adaptability. Because you have to spec into another stat just to be able to wield larger weapons, just so you can actually wear some respectable armor, or actually be able to medium or light roll, which when you think about it, that's kind of just like leveling up the adaptability stat. And also to mention that larger weapons as well are just going to swing a lot slower, meaning that more times than not you're going to be trading out, which taking damage is obviously not going to be a good thing, and arguably trading out with piercing swords is just going to be perfectly fine anyway, because these things get insanely high counter damage. They're obviously doing thrusting damage, meaning if you pair it alongside a Leo ring, you're just going to result in even more counter damage, and poking attacks typically just lunge further than other types of attacks in this game. So these weapons can honestly have more range than a lot of other smaller weapons, and with how fast the light attack combo is and how little stamina that it actually does cost as well, these things are just so incredibly easy to use. Now, the obvious downside for these weapons is that they're not going to get much poise damage, but if you just throw in the stone ring and just constantly R1 spam, you can just stagger enemies just as quick as almost anything else in the entire game. But to get into the options, I think the ice rapier is going to be the best one. It just gets ridiculously high damage, really good scalings, can be buffed, does get a unique projectile heavy attack. Honestly, all the rapiers are just really good. The Espada Repairer, Ricard's, and the regular rapier, all of these are just equally as good in terms of DPS. And you obviously get options like the Black Scorpion Stinger, which actually does poison build up, which poison in this game is broken. Now, unfortunately, this weapon actually doesn't get the high counter damage, but the poison could be a nice trade-off. But yeah, all of these piercing swords are just incredible. They're probably going to be pretty boring to use, but it doesn't change the fact that they're probably the most powerful. The best weapon class in Dark Souls 3 is going to go to the straight swords, and yeah, it's not even close as well. These things are just absolute machines. Now, just like in Dark Souls 2, I think smaller and quick weapons are just going to be more powerful on average and just much easier to use. Not only because they actually do swing faster, making them like less risky, but also because, you know, the vitality stat exists. Meaning if you actually want to use larger types of weapons, you're gonna have to spec into an additional stat, which is very beneficial because you want to actually have heavier armor when using larger weapons, because poise is extremely important. Now, thankfully, the poise is actually really good in this game, or the hyper armor at least, but it is called poise. Now, another benefit that larger weapons actually do have is that they can stagger enemies better, but in a game where like no enemies have any poise, it's not really going to make a difference. You can stagger like most enemies in this game even with a dagger, so it's not really going to be that necessary. Now, the reason why the straight swords are just incredible is because they have some of the fastest movesets in the entire game. The one-handed combos are just so incredibly quick. They get a really nice lunge, a very nice horizontal spread, which is very valuable in this game because enemies gank you more in Dark Souls 3, more so than any other game, even Dark Souls 2. If you think about it, Dark Souls 3 just gives you more ganks, and people don't really notice that because the game is actually balanced in the fact that enemies do get staggered very easily. And with how quick your movesets are in this game, and how easy it is to like redirect attacks, with how fluid the animations are, kind of like removed all the jank out of it, the ganking actually became less noticeable. But even outside of the R1 spamming, which honestly is the only button that you really need, it still actually gets some pretty decent movesets. If you did want vertical swipes, you could just two-hand it and use a light attack combo. If you wanted the poking attack, the one-handed heavy is there for you. The running attack is very quick and easy to use. And even like the typical weapon skill that you actually get with most of these straight swords in stance is actually very versatile. Actually does stagger enemies very nicely, and it is like a very direct counter to a lot of enemies that actually have shields. Now, in terms of the options, honestly, you can't really go wrong unless you're using like the broken straight sword. But everything from the long sword, broadsword, Lothric Knight Sword, all of the ones that can be buffed and infused are just going to be incredible. Now, for the ones that can't be infused, they're probably not going to be as good because the weapon arts tend to be a bit more gimmicky. Like Lothric Knight Sword, Valor Heart, and even the Rings Knight straight swords. They're pretty good, but they're not going to be better than just R1 spamming. But you also do get really good stuff for utility, like the Sunlight straight sword, which is going to be one of the best buffs to have in the entire game. The Morion Blade, which boosts your damage by so much if you're at lower health. And you even get some pretty cool unique options like the Gotthard Twin Swords, which all like paired weapons in this game are just incredible, and the Gotthards is just one of them. And something like the Irithyll straight sword can be pretty decent as well, although I do think it's outclassed by like almost every other straight sword because it can just get more damage and you can just put like a frost buff on it to just do the exact same thing. Getting into the Elden Ring weapon classes. Now, these are actually somewhat balanced between each class, despite how actually unbalanced the game actually is. I don't doubt that when the Elden Ring DLC comes out, it's going to throw a wrench in the works and just fuck up all types of balancing, or just like any type of balancing we actually had left. But to talk about the best weapon class in this game, as of right now, it's going to go to the greatswords, and I don't really see that changing as well even after the DLC. Now, I don't think the greatswords do anything too amazing. They just do everything really well. Like, their movesets are really good, especially with some of like the recent updates, which I say recent, but it's probably like a year ago from now, to where they boosted the speed of the running attacks and heavy attacks, and they just feel very nice and fluid now. There's obviously a good variation with the moveset. They also get some very good Ash of War options, but the thing is, the Ash of War options are always going to be better on another class. Things like Lion's Claw and Giant Hunt are just going to be better. On a Colossal Sword, something like Flaming Strike is going to be better. On like a Halberd or a Great Axe. But as for the poise damage of greatswords, they're pretty decent as well, but something like a hammer can actually get more poise damage. So yeah, as I was saying, it doesn't do anything the best, but it just does everything pretty nicely. But the reason as to why it's going to get number 1 is because all the options are fucking broken. Blasphemous Blade, Darkmoon Greatsword, Death's Poker, Sacred Relic Sword, Ordovis's Greatsword, Mariah's Executioner Sword. All of these are just S-tier broken weapons that house some of the most stupidest skills in the entire game that can make your entire playthrough just a complete and utter piss take and just fuck up everything. It really does. Like, I can't not put the greatswords at number 1 because these are the options of what you have. Now, if these options didn't exist, would the greatsword still get number 1? They could probably still deserve it. They're still really good. I probably would have put it to like the great hammers instead. Maybe something like the spears or the curved swords because they get really good power sense combos. But even all the other greatsword options that I didn't talk about, they're actually pretty decent as well. Obviously, I can't talk about the greatswords without mentioning the Claymore. That would just be sacrilegious. Something like the Knights or Banished Knights greatsword gets an amazing light attack combo. Obviously, the Flambeaux is a very good staple weapon, and even the Alabaster's Lordsword is actually pretty good too. So yeah, I think the greatsword category is probably the most stacked category in the entire series. Honestly, I hope they don't really add on to this weapon class into the DLC, because we have enough. Just add on to the weapon classes that actually need it, like scythes or thrusting swords. That would be kind of cool. But either way, it's going to be a classic of a DLC like it always is. But yeah, that is the video now completed. As always, just let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below, and please do like and subscribe. I do have some more videos coming out along the way. Now, the next FromSoft ranking video will most likely be the Twin Blades ranked from worst to best. I'm probably not going to do too many more FromSoft ranking videos because the DLC is going to come out soon, but I'll try and pump out as many as I can before then. But yeah, catch you guys around. Bye.